Good morning, everyone. Oh, beautiful. Hi, I'm Mako Rismi, and I'm honored to introduce our today's first speaker, Christine Keung. Christine Keung is a general partner at J2 Ventures, where she leads investment in dual-use technology that serve both commercial market and national security application. Her career spans both public and private sectors. She has worked across federal, state, and municipal government, held leadership roles at high-growth technology companies, including Dropbox and Figma, and served as an investor at Bridgewater Associates, Atomic VC, and a single-family office. As a U.S. Department of State Fulbright Scholar, Christine engaged with leaders including U.S. Ambassador to China Max Baucus, former Taiwanese President Ma Ying-jeou, and Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, and the World Health Organization on public health challenges in rural Western China. She is the youngest recipient of the Rolex Award for Enterprise, and in 2017 was recognized by Time magazines as a next generation leader for her work in China. Christine holds a Bachelor of Arts from Wellesley College and an MBA from Harvard Business School, and she's also an Albright Scholar, Albright Fellow. Additionally, she was the founder of the Wellesley Hackathon, which holds a personal significance for me, as the Wellesley Hackathon was something I wrote about in my college application to Wellesley, and later had an opportunity to participate and facilitate. I am very much looking forward to hearing her insights today. Christine will be speaking to us on venture capital as 21st century statecraft. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Christine Keung.
Good morning, everyone. It's really great to be back. When I started the Wellesley Hackathon in 2014, this was pre-Science Center renovation, pre-corporate sponsorships. And so, thank you to the Econ and CS departments for our $150 budget. This is also when pizza was still cheap though. It was pre-inflation. So it's great to be back and seeing, I actually haven't been back. I come back to campus typically once or twice a year, but I have not spoken at the Albright Institute since Secretary Albright's passing. So this is just an especially meaningful experience for me. I think when I was pulling together the slides yesterday, I was I actually just kind of went back to just some old photos that we took, including a time when Twitter was still called Twitter, not X. And this is, yes, a real tweet. And this actually is it's a photo from the very first Maddie Talk, which I know is still a thing, right? This actually 10 years ago, holy cow. This was January 30th, 2016. And then a little selfie I took in front of the women's restroom because there was a W with Secretary Albright. So as a Wellesley alum and a very, very proud Albright Fellow, the Institute didn't just shape how I studied global affairs, it also really shaped my understanding of power. I think the beauty of the Institute and also Secretary Albright's approach, right, is it challenges us to look beyond formal diplomacy, and it challenges us to try to understand, where power actually is exercised, how it compounds over time, and how economic and technological decisions shape power structures. And that's actually how I think about Statecraft today as a venture capitalist. When Madeleine Albright called the United States the indispensable nation, it really wasn't a compliment. It was a warning. She has lived through the Cold War as a refugee displaced by communism and fascism. And she understood that leadership is never guaranteed. It is built and it is continuously earned. And I would say that perspective of as the United States being an indispensable nation shapes a lot of the work I do with my fund at J2 Ventures, right, where we invest in technologies that are critical to national security interests. So I want to start with a little bit of Cold War history. Okay, fine. The article kind of gives it away, but I don't know if any of you guys are chess geeks. But do you know who that is? Or do you guys know who Bobby Fischer is? No worries. Actually, fun fact, there's an amazing Albright fellow, Anya Cork, who is actually one of the few female grandmasters. She was Wellesley class of 2013 and then Albright fellow 2012. At some point, we should bring her back. But that picture over there is Boris Spassky, Soviet Union grandmaster, playing Bobby Fischer, American grandmaster, during the Cold War. This was kind of a big deal back then. This was also before Netflix, so, you know, chess was like a lot more interesting to watch. And the reason why I wanted to like show you this picture is during the Cold War, power was often exercised indirectly, right? In lieu of military conflict, the United States and the Soviet Union were competing relentlessly in proxy wars, and chess was one of them. So matches between American and Soviet grandmasters weren't just games, they were symbolic battlegrounds. And chess was a proxy war for where foresight and patience and kind of structural advantage was played. So chess, you know, back then was pretty important. And the reason why I wanted to start with that is because, you know, some may say that we are now in a new Cold War, and the chessboard has changed. The pieces are no longer bishops and pawns, they're startups. And the moves are no longer end games. I'm making a lot of chess references, and so if none of that makes sense, don't stress about it. Just watch the Queen's Gambit on Netflix, and you'll know what I mean. But the new proxy war is actually startup investing. And instead of chess moves, it's really around ownership in the company and access to these companies. And that's what I really want to talk to you guys about today. A lot of what I do as a deep tech investor is focused on capital allocation. And venture capital is now becoming at the front line of 21st century geopolitics. When you kind of like open the news today, right, and you open the news today. God, I'm so old. You probably don't read like physical papers, but when you pull up X or you're looking at your news feed, you're looking at headlines that talk about, actually just today, right? TikTok is actually finalizing their sale to Oracle, right? You're following kind of what is going on in Eastern Europe, right? Where DJI drones, right, are actually kind of redefining how war is fought. But these things, these decisions, these access to technologies were actually made, these investment decisions were actually made by venture capitalists over 10 years ago. And these investment decisions have actually driven modern day geopolitics. And China, like the Soviet Union before it, sees technology not just as a tool for growth, but as a lever for power. And just like in the 20th century, the side that controls the board may well shape the future. I'm an Italian born, so I actually hold like an EU passport, but I'm also Chinese American. So I've lived on the crossroads of many worlds. I've had to negotiate the uneasy dance between economic cooperation and strategic competition. And that vantage point across diplomacy, across working at high growth tech companies, and now as a capital allocator, it's shaped how I think about national security challenges and the role of the private sector. So throughout my career, I've witnessed the breakdown of traditional silos between government, technology, and capital. The scale and reach of high-growth technology platforms create both immense opportunity, but also profound responsibility. What was once the domain of states is now shaped in startup boardrooms, and the private sector is no longer merely an implementer of public policy, it is a key architect in it. I was an early employee at Dropbox, and I actually saw this firsthand. When Dropbox was still a privately held company, I was there, I think, when we were still, a Series B company. So this was well over 10 years ago. The company was still fewer than 1,000 employees, yet we were serving over 500 million users worldwide. Just think about that scale. We were the world's largest cloud sharing platform. And so the decisions we made internally, right, on the business operations teams, on the product management teams, around data protection, around data, around threat detection, even how we were responding to government data requests, those weren't just operational decisions, they were geopolitical. And when your platform reaches billions, as it does for companies like Meta, right, and companies like Google, you're not just building products, you're setting norms. The code that you're writing becomes a vector of influence, and your terms of service shapes the boundaries of digital sovereignty. And when I graduated from Wellesley in 2014, I think because of my experience at the Albright Institute, it actually really inspired me to actually apply for a Fulbright scholarship. I was deeply, deeply inspired by Secretary Albright's own journey, and it actually led me to go and explore a career at the State Department. So that's actually where I started. This is a picture taken in Ningxia Autonomous Region with Ambassador Max Baucus, who's right there in the middle. And this was actually one of the first diplomatic visits to a predominantly Muslim part of China. This is like a region that I think would be hard for U.S. diplomats to access today, quite frankly, but it was a very, very different time in U.S.-China relations back when we were there in 2014. And one of the things that I just kind of wanted to flag is the fact that geopolitical tensions are no longer about just territorial disputes or military postures. They're playing out in semiconductor supply chains and in open source code bases. And the risks of dual use technologies outpacing international consensus is very real. I just dropped the term dual use. I want to just see a show of hands. Like, how many of you guys know what dual use is? Or how many of you guys have heard about this term? Got it. Okay, I might just do some cold calling. Ananya, you had your hand up first. What is dual use?
Dual use technology. Oh, thank you. Dual use technology is technology that can be applied in both civilian and military applications. So if we think, for example, of nuclear technology, right? Nuclear energy can be used in civilian energy infrastructure, but it can also be used for wartime applications, or something like semiconductor chips, as you've mentioned. Also have both civilian and military applications, so they're considered dual use.
Perfect definition. So that's what I do on a day-to-day. But with the caveat, though, is my firm, we don't invest in technologies that would support kinetic warfare. But what you'll actually see in this presentation is how the context of war has shifted dramatically. The way wars are being fought has shifted a lot, and that's also kind of informed how we've kind of deployed our investment strategies. But yes, that is actually what we do, and thanks for defining that for us. One of the things that I think we were aware of at the State Department even 10 years ago is that we live in a world where AI-enabled startups can deploy capabilities in months that once took governments years. And so even when I was a Fulbrighter, I had an opportunity to go and visit Chinese technology companies, right? This was over 10 years ago when I think the US was still very much on the forefront of technological development. But even back then, having had a chance to see some of the advanced manufacturing capabilities in Shenzhen and visiting DJI when they were still privately held companies, I think we at the State Department did have a sense of what was to come. And I think we are now kind of living in a new world that is shaped by technological geopolitical competition. And one of the things that I wanted to discuss today is how the lever of global power today is actually capital. Because the capital that you accept as an entrepreneur, it doesn't just fund your company, it shapes the trajectory of your company. Venture capital rewards speed and scale. If you take debt, it imposes early discipline. And government grants, right? So free money from the government through SBA loans, that might bring alignment with the mission, but a lot less flexibility. So every source of capital that you're considering as an entrepreneur carries with it its own set of expectations. And those expectations shape everything: who you hire, what you build, and who you build it for. Founders often ask me, when I'm giving them an investment offer, they usually ask me what my valuation is, right? They want me to help them price what their privately held company is, or how much they're worth. But what I think the more important question that founders should be asking is, what kind of company does this capital want me to become? And nowhere is that question more urgent than the story of U.S. venture capital in China. For 2 decades, American firms that once backed Cold War defense tech also funded the rise of China's most geopolitically sensitive companies. The pursuit of scale, returns, and market share led U.S. capital to fuel the growth of China's tech giants. Why did this happen? Well, for 3 reasons. Talent. China has world-class engineers at a lower cost. Market, 1 billion users is hard to ignore. And kind of a lack of guardrails. Investments back then were made with spreadsheets, not statecraft. And so when I was working for when I was a Fulbright fellow in China over 10 years ago, this was actually a time when U.S. venture capitalists all had headquarters in Beijing and Shanghai. It was a very, very different time in deep tech investing. And as a result, US venture capital became a force multiplier for Chinese innovation, accelerating growth in drones, AI, and surveillance systems. Some of the companies that the US helped build are now on sanctions list. Some of the technologies that we backed are being used to undermine democratic values. And these investments have had long-term consequences for national security, industrial competitiveness, and global technology governance. So let's walk through a few examples. DJI, Dajiang Innovation. How many of you guys have heard of this company? Okay, like a good amount. It is, this is kind of the world's premier drone company. It controls 70% of the market share. It films weddings and it fights wildfires, but it also now appears on the battlefields in Ukraine. And so what a lot of people don't realize is the fact that one of their early backers was Kleiner Perkins. Okay, all right, so then, all right, next one is TikTok. So raise your hands. How many of you have heard of this one? Okay, more people, that's great. So TikTok, right, AKA ByteDance, it's been in the news a lot lately, but also most of you probably use it. So TikTok is the viral video app that's been turned into a geopolitical flashpoint. There's been a lot of concerns around data security as well as algorithmic manipulation, which has led to bipartisan legislation to force the sale of TikTok. And their sale to Oracle is actually still being finalized to this day. And the early backers of TikTok were actually US venture capital firms Sequoia and Susquehanna International. What about SenseTime? How many of you have heard of this company? Not too many. That's probably good. SenseTime is actually, it is a pioneer in facial recognition. This is a company that is backed by large corporations like Qualcomm, as well as SoftBank Vision Fund, right, which is a large Japanese venture capital fund and conglomerate. But SenseTime technologies have also been implicated in the surveillance of ethnic minorities. And so I present these examples just to show you the complexity, right? Like these are all Chinese technology companies. You've probably heard about them in the news at some point, but this is kind of where the role of capital, I think a lot of folks don't realize like the role that American investors and American capital had played in developing these technologies. And I actually think, quite frankly, the VCs, the venture capitalists that backed these companies over 10 years ago, when they were still consumer companies or commercially focused companies, they also did not imagine how the scope of these businesses can change. These investments were not made to harm national security, but in the absence of a strategic framework, financial incentives raced ahead of geopolitical foresight. The truth is, American and Chinese economies are deeply, almost inseparably linked. China supplied the scale, the speed, and the manufacturing muscle, and the US supplied the capital, the code, and the ambition. One economy enabled the other, and now as tensions rise, we are confronting a paradox, how two rivals became each other's greatest accelerants. These are, I don't know how, like if you guys are talking about the Ukraine war, but one of the reasons why we are in a state of total warfare, right, where wars are beginning with no end in sight, is because technologies such as high-performing but cheap drones are changing the unit economics of war. Right, DJI drones retail for about $300 to $400, but they have the capacity to destroy, hundreds of millions of dollars of equipment. And so, in a world where that's actually how wars are fought, it has actually extended the timeline of war. That is the role. This is sort of the effects of venture capital and venture-backed companies in modern warfare. And policymakers are finally catching up. And so you are starting to see that through outbound investment screening, reverse CFIUS proposals, and tighter due diligence. Because while capital may be blind to borders, it is not free from consequences. Another example I wanted us to walk through is the solar industry. This is a really good example of how the cost of short-term thinking actually made us less competitive in what used to be, frontier and critical technologies. So in the early 2000s, the United States actually led the world in solar innovation. But over the last 2 decades, China has seized over 80% of the global solar supply chain. When prices collapsed in the early 2010s, US firms backed by private equity folded. And so Chinese manufacturers that were backed by the state or the people, the Communist Party, they were able to scale and dominate. So a wave of bankruptcies ended up actually wiping out a lot of the privately held solar companies, and it led to mass sales of these assets to Chinese state-owned enterprises. And this market shakeout marked a turning point. China seized dominance in global solar manufacturing, while many Western firms exited, consolidated, or pivoted to downstream services. The US largely left the market, especially with inconsistent government subsidies. And this is actually one of the reasons why we are no longer ahead when it comes to solar. And today we're in the midst of another clean tech boom and bust cycle. So many of the companies formed after the last crisis could no longer raise what's called private capital, right? So basically where you exchange ownership of your company, all right, in exchange for what's called dilutive capital. And so most of the solar companies that were founded in the last 10 years were actually financed via debt. And so during after COVID, the interest rates rose, and that led to another wave of solar bankruptcies. This is just to kind of show you how I think we focus a lot on how companies are formed, where the IP is developed, where these companies are built, but we rarely talk about who is actually financing the company and how the source of capital you take actually affects the trajectory. And so I wanted to show you guys a graph of solar bankruptcies from 2021 and until around 2 years ago, right? Just showing you that the crisis isn't over, right? The amount of bankruptcies that are happening in the U.S., even within this industry, puts us in a position where it is unlikely the United States will ever lead when it comes to solar production. But capital is only one side of the story. The other is people. Since the Cold War ended, we have lived through a golden age, not just of technology, but of global exchange. Openness drove progress. It gave us the internet, it gave us the mRNA vaccines, and unicorn startups born out of dorm rooms across the world. But that openness is under threat. In 2021, President Trump ended the Fulbright program in China and Hong Kong. This was actually the program that I used to get to China back in 2014. That program no longer exists. And Trump called it a soft power tool that no longer served U.S. interests. That in 2025, so this was just last year, his administration expanded that approach, issuing an executive order that suspended funding for international education and exchange programs beyond just China. Thousands of scholars were left in limbo, and decades of cultural diplomacy was undone with a single executive order. That same year, not in 2025, but in 2021, again, President Xi Jinping actually did something similar, and this is something that wasn't talked about as much. So Xi Jinping launched sweeping education reforms that sent shockwaves through China's test prep industry. Practically overnight, private tutoring for core school reforms became illegal. And the reason why I wanted to show you guys this graph is on the New York Stock Exchange, one of the most popular stocks was a Chinese company called New Oriental Education. At its peak, it had, I think it was actually at around $200 a share. So this was considered a really good stock, a huge market cap. But if you look at what happened in 2021, when President Xi made the entire industry illegal overnight, it actually caused a stock crash. And, the rhetoric from the CCP around this policy decision is around trying to make sure that access to test prep is democratized. But another way you could interpret this type of decision is to curb Western influence and to limit access to test prep that would allow Chinese students to come and study abroad. Because I don't know, are any of you in the room are you guys Chinese nationals? So most of you probably had to take the TOEFL at some point, right? or take the SAT, and if you want to go to grad school, probably take the LSAT or the GRE. And so companies like Xingdongfang, right, or New Oriental Education, these are services that actually allow you to go and study for the exams you need to go abroad. And this policy has severely limited access to that. And so these may look like isolated policies from President Xi and from President Trump, but I would like to argue that it's signaling a dangerous trend towards a future defined by isolationism. As a venture capitalist, I invest in people as much as I do in technologies. And when we restrict people, we don't just close borders, we close minds. Because when fear replaces openness, the future is no longer shaped by shared breakthroughs, but by zero-sum thinking and xenophobia. Olga, you know this. I actually just flew in from Las Vegas. And so, and I just came from what's called CES, the Consumer Electronics Show. This is the world's largest tech conference and a reliable barometer for where innovation is concentrated. Before 2020, Chinese companies dominated CES, often making up over a third of the exhibitors. In 2018 alone, there was more than 1,500 Chinese firms, but by 2023, that number has dropped below 500. And quite frankly, I've been going to CES for over a decade. It was actually a record low in terms of Chinese technology company participation at CES. And major players like Huawei, like DJI, and Alibaba were noticeably missing this year. Their absence signals decoupling, it signals export controls, and a world where technology is no longer neutral, and access to chips, data, capital, and markets is now shaped by geopolitics. At the same time, what we're seeing in CES and in the markets is defense spending is rising across the United States and allied nations. I actually did have some headlines, but one of the things that I think for those of you who've been following defense policy in both the EU and Japan, you are actually seeing defense spending as a percentage of GDP triple and quadruple over the last year. And that's because deterrence now runs through AI, it runs through autonomy, it runs through access to cyber capabilities. Nations are no longer just defending borders, they are defending supply chains, compute, data, and industrial capacity. And that's kind of where I wanted to end, right? Because this is just the state of the world, this is the state of my industry. And I do kind of want to talk about why is it especially meaningful for me to reflect on what I do professionally after grad? And I've graduated from Wellesley for over, I was class of 2014. So, a lot has changed in the last 12 years. And it's especially meaningful for me to stand in this room and face such a diverse group of students, because I can say, as someone who does a lot of work in national security, who spends a lot of time at the Pentagon, there are not a lot of people who look like me in the rooms making capital allocation decisions. And we're already seeing the consequences, right? We are seeing the consequences in terms of who is getting funding, right, and who is being kept from funding. And I think that if the United States wants to remain the indispensable nation in the 21st century, it will be because we remain the best place to build. And the only way you can be that best place is by attracting the best talent. And the best talent is actually everywhere. It's not just in the United States. It's not just even, I love Wellesley, but it's not just at Wellesley, right? Talent is global. And for a long time, I've always believed that you should give entrepreneurs the freedom and the capital to turn ideas institutions and not restrict it. But that is changing, because you are seeing, access to AI, to compute. It is sort of the new arms race, and you are seeing nations around the world starting to build their own sovereign capabilities instead of trying to create frameworks for cross-border collaboration. And that's why immigration policy isn't just symbolic, it's strategic. When it becomes restrictive or driven by fear, we don't just slow down innovation. We are sending a signal that America is closing at a very moment where leadership demands openness. Around the world, nations are building sovereign technology stacks, but sovereignty comes at the expense of openness, and we are not just losing collaboration, we are losing talent, trust, and long-term advantage. Wellesley and the Albright Institute reflect a truth that we can't afford to forget, that openness and diversity are strategic advantages. Secretary Albright has taught us that America leads not by closing off, but by investing in the people who choose to build here. And that's the message I just want to leave you with. Please don't forget that. Please be open to each other. Please find ways to collaborate because the world needs you to. Thank you.
Thank you for this really important talk. My name is Mercy, and I'm a senior here. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to ask one to give my colleagues also time to ask questions. You say that when you're like investing in companies, you want them to think of what kind of a company does this capital want me to become, which led me to think that when it comes like to companies, because when you're attracting too much investments, you want to give up, you want to like have like sizable results, so you want to like grow and grow. So I'm thinking like when you start a company, there is this high possibility that you started with like good intentions. You're looking at social benefit and everything, and then out of maybe not all of a sudden or along the way, it just turns into something that you did not imagine. But you have the capital, you have the people, you have the backing, investors and stakeholders are like, give us the money, we want to see the profits from this. So I want to ask, like, from your experience, when did you see, or when do you think you start to notice signs of things going like sideways? Or what do you think, like, as young people who want to create, what do you think we should keep in mind such that whenever we're going such a road, we're like, okay, I should come back before like it's too late? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there is some subjectivity to how you define sideways, right? I mean, the reality is, like, I run a venture fund that is focused on around national security capabilities and industrial competitiveness in the United States. And so I'm not against my companies working with the Department of War or actually it is called the Department of War, or the US government, right? We don't support kinetic capabilities, but we do support other capabilities. Actually, a really good example is, I'm actually wearing it now, like we were investors in the Aura Ring. I don't know if you guys have heard of it, but yeah, really? I was like, you're so young, you don't need a sleep track. You're not going to get any sleep at Wellesley anyways. Right, like the Aura Ring is a consumer wearable, right? It helps you manage it helps monitor your sleep, it helps monitor your periods. It's great. But the U.S. military actually uses it. So our firm actually helped the U.S. military get a $100 million, or set up a $100 million pilot for the Aura, because during the pandemic, military bases were actually using the Aura for proactive isolation. The Aura is so sensitive that it knows when you're about to get sick or when you're about to get COVID before you do. And so that's actually an example where we're really happy that the U.S. military has these capabilities. We think it makes like their roles safer. And that's actually like I would say, like, if you're an entrepreneur you're working on, you're building a technology that has multiple use cases, just think really critically about who you're selling equity positions in your company to, right? Like, I think for my firm, we're very open about how we think about dual use, where we like to add strategic value, and we are actually passionate about helping the government access the best technologies, but we do guardrail it in terms of how that's being used. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Mako, and then it's a kind of similar question, but you said like you don't invest in a company and people who has like a closed mindset and closed borders. But what if like those companies/people are super profitable in the short term, but like in the long term, when you see it, like it doesn't really fit, like align with your philosophy? How do you balance out those like profit versus philosophy part? Yeah.
Yeah, so this is actually where the type of capital you take will inform your business decisions, right? Because if you take debt, right? So debt is where you're actually maintaining ownership of your company and you're just borrowing, right? Instead, to fuel your business expenses. Profitability doesn't really matter, right? As long as you can pay it back. And so that's kind of my point around. There's so many different ways you can finance your business, right? Like I do, so I venture capital is private equity, right? So typically when I'm writing a founder a check, I am asking for an equity position in the company. I'm asking to sit on their capitalization table. And typically for us, we actually take a board seat. And so I invest in a very active and ownership-oriented way, but not all entrepreneurs choose that path. Many of our professors at Wellesley, right, and at other universities, when they're building original intellectual property, they might actually be applying for government grants. Some of those have been funded by this administration, but when you hear things about like the Centers for Disease, or CDC, right, or for the NIH, they are actually giving grants, right, or functionally free capital to support research. And those are cases where, Olga, like if you get $5 million from the NIH, you're not actually giving up ownership in your IP or your company. So that just gives you a sense of like there are trade-offs between ownership and capital. And typically when founders are taking capital from me, they are giving me ownership in their company in exchange for strategic guidance, for introductions, but also with kind of the intention to grow very fast. But that's not a fit for all companies.
So you talked a little bit about how U.S. tech companies that were operative during the Cold War were then really influential in funding Chinese startups. To me, that kind of speaks to almost like a sponsor proxy relationship, where when you have ownership or when you're providing capital, you have some kind of ownership and you are able to provide some kind of guidance. What role do you think that plays in, like, I guess on a broader level beyond just like U.S.-China relations, shaping what the U.S.'s role is? Like from a private company's perspective, right? Does the U.S. have the ability, or should the U.S. have the ability to go abroad to countries and say, like, I don't know, like South Asia, right? And take ownership of those companies, kind of try and influence their operations as like a broader means of influencing, I guess, like national security objectives. Is that, I don't know, is that something that like private actors should be doing kind of outside of the scope of like the government and what it wants? I don't know, you've talked a lot about like how without guardrails on investing, a lot of these, I guess a lot of companies can grow in ways that weren't intended. How do private companies, I guess, like predict what those relationships might look like, or like predict what those outcomes might be, and then use their investment to shape that? Like outside, like I guess like in like a broader global context, so like outside of U.S.-China relations.
There are like 5 questions, so let's just go through it one at a time. And what I care a lot about is I'm not trying to. I'm not here to say what's right or what's wrong. I actually hope you experience this more. Well, outside of my like last like hot take about like immigration, like pro-immigration, pro-diversity, but I wanted to talk more about just like this is what's already happening. It's complex, it's nuanced, and every company, like every country in the world is sort of doing it. The Cold War, I'm glad you brought up the Cold War because the Department of Defense, or back then it was actually called the Department of War, was actually the main venture capitalist in developing critical technologies. So the biggest funder of the internet was actually the DoD, right? It's even like EHR, electronic health records, right, which we all use, that was actually developed also by the military. So there was a time when the development and the funding of those technologies was actually concentrated around the government. And so you can imagine back then, it's like, when DARPA was formed, right, it was certainly formed with a very national security heavy interest. That's changed quite a bit now, right? Like we haven't taken money from the government, and so I work very closely with national security, but I technically work for my LPs, right, which are large endowments and banks that have funded me to go and invest in companies. And so what's happening now is there's more, like the set of funding priorities have changed significantly because the Department of Defense is no longer the main source of capital for deep tech. You have funds like mine, you have funds like Sequoia, but you also have sovereign, sovereign nation funds, right? Like the PIF from Saudi Arabia or Temasek from Singapore. And so we are living at a time when all of these privately held startups have an access to a range of capital, but also a range of expectations. And really for the founder, I mean, the only way, what's kind of nice about entrepreneurship is, you can kind of choose who owns pieces of your company. And so I like to kind of give this presentation just to kind of remind people, though, that the capital you're accepting is kind of co-authoring your trajectory, right? When you're taking money from, from Temasek, right? So like the Singaporean Sovereign Wealth Fund versus taking a grant from the Department of Defense versus taking private capital from me. These are people who are going to shape your company. They're going to be, and they will help affect how that technology is applied, and it's important for you to just think critically about that. So hopefully, I didn't mean to make it like so US-China heavy, but I like using China as an example because these are the technologies that are in the headline the most, and I think a lot of people kind of forget the complexity to how these companies got financed. Yeah.
Hi. From sort of a non-tech or econ background, I'm curious what sort of guardrails you think can be implemented or should be implemented in like the venture capital investing world. And then second, I'm curious, like I feel like the playing field, or from your talk, the playing field in terms of militarism is becoming like you used the word architect in the beginning, but everything's becoming increasingly like dematerialized and abstract. So like secondly, how can guardrails be implemented in the security and defense industry when things are like happening under your nose because statecraft is being played out in code rather than in, the development of tanks?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. I'll start with the latter, right? I think things feel more abstract now because they're more decentralized. And I actually think Secretary Albright has always had, she was always very attuned to that, right? Like around non-state actors and how even technology companies could be non-state actors. Like the selfie that I posted in front of W, that actually wasn't taken at Wellesley. She came to visit me at Dropbox like over 10 years ago because at the time she was running a consulting firm. And so even as a diplomat, even as a former Secretary of State, I think Secretary Albright kind of realized that it was important to have a very keen understanding of the role that the private sector plays. And this was over a decade ago, right? I would say the private sector has never been more relevant in architecting global geopolitics. I think a really good example of that is, the role of Starlink in the Ukraine war. Just to show of hands, how many of you guys know kind of what I'm referencing to? Oh, great, all right. So this is an example where, Starlink, a privately owned company, right, founded by Elon Musk, sort of made the decision to restrict access to communications in a war context. That could not happen in the Cold War, right? And these were not decisions that were happening that were being made in the Pentagon. It was being made by a private sector actor in the boardroom. And so this is that is kind of the role of technology in modern geopolitics. And the reason why it feels a little bit more abstract is because the people who get to make that decision is no longer the government, right? It is actually it is actually more and more so disproportionately it's corporations and it's privately held companies. And in some cases they're startups. Yeah. So that's the first question. I think you had more in there, but around guardrails. I genuinely don't have, I don't think I'm in a position to say what guardrails should be there, right? Because you have, of course, nation-state policies that are going to reflect national interests, but I can tell you at least the guardrails that I have, right, as an investor is I have what's called a fiduciary duty. So when I manage capital on behalf of hospital systems, on behalf of endowments, I have a duty to basically make profit maximizing decisions. And that's because the people who give me capital to manage, right, they are kind of expecting me to basically return that, right? If they give us $100 million, their expectation is one, for me not to lose that $100 million, because that'd be bad, and it actually affects those institutions' ability to do things like provide scholarships. But they actually sort of asked me to sort of go and make investment decisions that would maximize what that $100 million can be. So this isn't just, and this is, I'm not talking about this from like a moral perspective. It is just like for professional investors, that is what a fiduciary duty is. Like we have that. And of course, we have to follow the law, right? But the laws are not determined by the investors, right? It is determined by members of Congress. There can be restrictions to what I invest in. So for some of my limited partners, so the people who invest in my fund, these are hospital systems, these are banks, they have what's called ESG mandates. And so they have the power to basically say to me, hey, we don't want you to invest in weapons. We don't want you to invest in certain types of drugs, right? They're able to actually enforce guardrails, but the guardrails actually come at the allocator level. Yeah, but that is, I do just want to flag, like, that is actually starting to change, because you are starting to see sovereign wealth funds around the world starting to invest directly into defense. And so the ESG guardrails that existed when we were raising our fund 4 or 5 years ago, it's starting to change.
And then I'll pass back.
Okay. I'm wondering if you can speak more to the role that tech giants are playing in national security, and maybe like the danger of that in some way. Like, none of us elected Elon Musk to be, I mean, like, the people didn't, it's debatable the extent to which people's interests are being represented in the state in general right now. But I think like there's some idea that people who have been, like, specifically mostly white men, who have been able to climb this ladder and accumulate enough power, who have no accountability to the people, are being able to like kind of navigate national security. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to like the ways in which these like higher ups are being able to be conflated with politicians and politics.
Well, there are so many examples. I mean, first of all, Elon does not represent our interests. And I don't say that from a political perspective, right? He's the CEO of a privately held company. One of them is publicly traded. But ultimately, it's like the only interests that he has sort of a legal obligation to respect are those of his shareholders. And again, that sounds like such a cold and core, but that is simply true, right? Like, Elon was not elected by the people, which means he does not, it's not his job to actually represent our interests, right? The only people that are supposed to represent our interests are the ones we actually elect through a democratic process. But the reason why Elon, right, has disproportionate control is because the companies that he has built are sort of the winners in critical sectors, right? Like telecommunications, like mobility. The things that I care a lot about is at least creating healthy competition and mitigating monopoly in these sectors, right? All of us are consumers of telecom. We are consumers of media. We are consumers of mobility, right? Like, I was working in Silicon Valley when Uber was probably one of the most controversial companies, but all of us have taken the Peter Pan bus. And let's be real, like, I wish I had Uber when I was on campus, right? We are all consumers of these technologies. We actually give these companies power because they have access to our dollars. So it's not about, like, the goal here isn't about like what's right, what's wrong, what shouldn't be. Like, I'm definitely not like the adjudicator of that, but I would just want us to basically lay out the power structures, but also understand the role that we play in it. As long as you consume the technology that might be built by somebody that you don't believe in, right? Or you elect officials that are disproportionately giving power to these companies or creating an ecosystem where there isn't competition, we are actually enabling what's happening right now.
I am a biochem major and wanting to be a physician, so I'm going to ask you about technology in healthcare, because you talked about the Aura ring earlier, and I saw something about Aura selling its data that it's collected, and how like health data is a huge topic right now because it can be linked back to someone and it's so personal, it can't be changed, and can also be used for discrimination. So at the same time, I think it's like technology clearly plays like a huge role in healthcare and helping people with their health. So how do we balance like the sensitivity of like, say, health data, or the risk of like what we can do with health data and what technology can pose for that, but also the benefit of technology in healthcare?
Yeah, no, these are really good questions. First of all, I don't think Aura is selling their data, but it'd be a problem if I don't know about it. So send me that article when you get a chance. But Yeah, well, look, I can only speak to Aura, but then I'm happy to also talk about other examples, right? One of the things I really appreciate about Aura as a company is it's actually a Finnish company, so it's not an American company, and so I think, and actually, I don't know if you guys know what GDPR is, or have like global data protection regulation. So this is sort of like a set of laws pushed out by the European Union around, just really kind of making sure that individuals have, that like they see private, like the EU see privacy as a human right. And so, or it being a European company is actually very, very sensitive to data protection, to making sure the data is anonymized. They want the data to be useful, right? At the same time, they do care. There is actually a lot of like European sensibilities to how they build this company. But there has been like more public examples around 23andMe, right? 23andMe is, it was like a genetic testing company that was founded by by Anne Wojcicki, and the company did go bankrupt. And when it sold to private equity, that data got sold. So it does. So I'm not trying to say that doesn't happen, but that's actually kind of an example where 23andMe took a lot of private equity. It wasn't profitable. It didn't meet the expectations of their investors, which put them on a path of bankruptcy. And the reason why that data got sold, right, is because those investors basically were trying to get their money back. To your point about kind of the dangers of, or potential dangers, all right, of our data being correlated and leading to discrimination. I mean, it's very real. So I don't want to pretend that that's like all of us, like every single day, like, I mean, I'm generating a lot of data about myself, like just by waving my hands, right? The Aura is thinking I'm like walking 2 miles, and that is data that I care about. I think, but that is also something where I see that not really, I see like the role of regulation, right? Like the US doesn't actually have comprehensive like privacy laws, right? Like Equifax can lose my data and there are almost no repercussions, but I don't actually see that as something private sector companies should be defining. I think they are defining it because there is sort of a vacuum. But in absence of that, it's like I would actually ask our regulators to start creating more comprehensive reform around our healthcare data, because there is demand from consumers to use devices that create value out of our data.
Hi, thank you. I'm Crystal. So I'm coming from a non-econ background, and from my understanding, most of people in this room won't become investors. So you were talking about like being mostly like the different one in the room, and then having to maybe like influence others. And I was wondering if you could speak more about your responsibility as an individual investor, because you can speak about your guardrails, but do you try to influence other people? And when you are, like, can you talk more about like what it is like to push for example, like pro-immigration, pro-diversity? Like what kind of audience are you usually speaking to?
Yeah. First of all, Crystal, you never know. I got to tell you, like I was an econ major, but I actually thought I would go and get a PhD. So it's not, I didn't, like investing for me is like a relatively new role, and it wasn't actually something I like set out to do. I got more interested in it because of like all the slides that I shared with you. So you actually never know, and I really do encourage like you all. I'm not asking you all to go and become investors, but I do actually see a lot of value within the investment community to have people with your experiences, with your diversity of thought. I actually think we need a lot of that, especially when investors have the power to control the trajectory of these companies. And I guess to your point about, I guess my personal investing, or how my responsibility as an individual investor, I mean, that's where I don't have it, like, because you guys are all, I mean, you guys are all individual investors to a certain point, right? Like you all have control over how you spend your money. So, I mean, at least for me, I personally choose to use it, like I would invest in companies that reflect my own values. But the nice thing about being a general partner and having a venture fund is the way I invest even now is it's still a reflection of our values as a team, right? Not just around the technology capabilities and how it's used, but also around the founders that we back, right? Like I'm actually really, really proud of our portfolio. I invest in mostly deep tech founders, but over 50% of our founders are either women or of backgrounds that are typically underrepresented, right? And so you actually have a lot of power, even as an institutional investor, to basically help fund and kind of create the dynamics that you want to see. And as an individual investor, it's there was definitely a time when I was like boycotting Uber. Uber's like not controversial anymore, right? Yeah, it really was like 10 years ago.
Hello, my name is Talia and I'm a senior. And I was really intrigued by what you're talking about with investment in in international development almost, especially with the I guess the new proxy wars between US and China. And I know a little bit about how Chinese companies are investing in certain less developed countries to create this almost debt relationship.
Yeah.
And I've heard from certain US state figures that they are encouraging, or that they hope to encourage, private companies in the US to kind of invest in those same areas because they want to have more of a presence in those areas. And I guess, have you felt any pressure or heard any conversations like that where you feel the pressure to invest in those countries because of that, I guess, tension with China?
Yeah, so not so much pressure in, well, I am restricted from investing in technology that originates from certain countries, right? As you can imagine, all of my companies have government contracts, and so because of CFIUS restrictions and kind of where we're at geopolitically, I am restricted. I don't get pressured necessarily to go and, which is probably a good thing. It's ultimately, I care the most about backing the best technologies and the best teams, especially because I'm usually the very first check-in. So I'm an early stage investor. I'm usually investing in these companies when they're still less than 5 or 10 people. And so it's a very different relationship that I have, because you're almost part of you're kind of on that founding journey with them. But the geopolitics is there. I was sharing with Mako, I do go to Japan on a regular basis. The Japanese government does invite me out there to speak at the conferences. But the reason why they would want American venture capitalists to come out there is because they want the companies that I invest in that might be manufacturing elsewhere, they want them to come to Japan. And so governments are basically using invitations to venture capitalists and these sort of conferences as a way of kind of getting access to technologies that could help grow their economies. You're seeing that in Japan, you're seeing that in Singapore and Korea. I want to talk a little bit about Africa, because I haven't mentioned that yet, but this is really, really important, because I would say a lot of deep technology is built by China, right? Companies like SenseTime, companies like DJI, but also even just all telecommunication companies like Huawei. First of all, they're all over the United States, but they're definitely in developing countries, because when China comes in and builds roads and bridges and telecom infrastructure, those countries are adopting a technology stack, and that with the technology stack comes a set of guardrails and values that align with national interests, right? So I talk about Aura being a Finnish company that operates in the United States, right? Which means that the people who are making Aura, the privacy policy, the terms of service, all the boxes that you checked when you bought your Aura, it's going to be compliant with those national interests, right? But if you're in Ghana and you're using Huawei telecommunications, that's, those guardrails, those terms are usually negotiated at kind of the nation state level. And I'm not going to pretend to be an expert at that, but that is something I want to flag. But that's also kind of what happens when you have market competition, right? Or perfect market competition. Because 10 years ago, when you were in a place where both American and Chinese companies could compete globally, if their technological capabilities are more advanced than the sovereign capabilities, it's not hard for a U.S. city to want to use Huawei technologies when they're 80% cheaper and potentially 50% more performant. But now we are seeing this trend where nations are kind of deciding, oh my gosh, I don't want to use just U.S. technologies. I don't want to just use European technologies. We want those capabilities ourselves, and that's kind of what we're seeing now. And I actually have empathy for that, right? I know some of that when I talk about sovereignness and less openness, it can sound scary and it can sound wrong, but the counterpoint to that is actually having some empathy for why, right? Why are nations wanting to be less reliant on the technologies built by one company? Sometimes it's because they're not fully aligned with those values and they want to have an alternative.
Okay, so thank you so much. I think we have more questions. I know this, Ria. I saw you, but we do need to wrap here, and let's just. there's time to ask Christine questions afterwards because I think she's staying around
I'm
pretty
staying
much
for
all
lunch,
day
yeah.
for lunch and everything. So
Yeah.
sorry, but I have to be like the the party pooper here. But thank
Thanks,
you so
Olga.
much for coming. Let's thank Christine.
Thanks for having me.